Hello, Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's great to see you.
Good. I'm actually looking at the video. Like, looks like we're matching now. We both have like the orange cord.
We both got a memo, right? And so we
Yeah.
we both have had a matching have, have the
Yeah.
matching headsets.
Yeah. Okay. So, we haven't spoken in a while. We actually we really took a break during the middle of the healing of the paralytic, but
Hmm.
we don't have to worry. I could tell you the ending is that he's going to be healed
Hmm.
and he'll walk again. So today we're going to just pick up right where we left off, and we're going to jump right into the story. And the story, I think, if you want to read a little bit before, but we're going to be doing verse 9-7 today.
9-7. Yeah, maybe I can start with verse 6 onwards.
Yeah, sure.
No, yeah. The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 9, verse 6 onwards. But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He then said to the paralytic, Rise, pick up your bed and go home. And he rose and went home.
Right. So I have a bunch of questions for you today. One, I just want to make an observation, and that observation is that while I think we view Jesus as messianic and hence his miraculousness is coming from who he himself is, what's very interesting is in that time period, it was actually very common to have not only miracle workers but healers. So I found like a story, and I only bring this story because I think it's so innocuous. It's almost like a throwaway story in the Talmud. It's from Brachos, page 5 on the 5b, and it says Rav Chia bar Abba was sick. Rav Yochanan, who was a third century Palestinian rabbi, so this would happen 200 years after, but roughly the same cultural context from this. And Rav Yochanan went to visit him. Rav Yochanan said to him, Is your suffering dear to you? Do you enjoy the pain
Hmm.
that you're experiencing? Because if you enjoy the pain, maybe you're getting more merit from the next world. You're getting your punishment in this world. So Rav Chia bar Abba said, I don't enjoy the pain and I don't even want the reward. So Rav Yochanan said, Give me your hand. He gave him his hand and he stood up and he was healed. So what's interesting is that this person was somehow bedridden. He couldn't get up, and he was healed because philosophically, Rabbi Yochanan deemed it that it wasn't beneficial to this man to continue to be sick. So one more story. Rav Yochanan himself now, this rabbi was sick, and Rav Chanina went to visit him. So it's very common also to visit the sick. The
Hmm.
Talmud says that when you visit the sick, 1/60th of their injury is taken away. What's interesting about just like I'll finish the story in one moment. But what's interesting about our story is that it's hard to even imagine what's happening. If you go jump all the way back to 9-2, you'll see, and just then some people were carrying a paralyzed man laying on a bed. So we never talked about what the historical context. One is that he was so rich that he couldn't get up, but he used to have people carry him around. That definitely is a possibility. But another possibility is that they were running out to see Jesus because they thought he could heal and he just came across the sea. But that read seems a little bit less likely, considering that it writes, and just then some people. It looks like it wasn't necessarily planned for these four people to carry him. But for whatever reason, there's like this weird situation that paralytics are kind of getting swept away into the public somehow. Okay, putting that aside, but back to our story from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud of Brachos. It said when Rav Yochanan was sick, Rav Chanina went to visit him. He said to him, just like Rav Yochanan asked, "Is your suffering dear to you?" He said, "My suffering is not dear to me, and I don't want the reward. AKA, this sucks. I don't like being sick, and I want to be healed." He said, "Give me your hand." He stood up. He stood up. He says, um, "We heard from the last story that Rav Yochanan healed Rav Chia bar Abba, why doesn't Rav Yochanan just heal himself?" And they say a prisoner can't free himself from his prison, and therefore Rav Yochanan could only heal other people, but not himself. But the point of the story is that this idea of a healer was common. We noted in the past that there's different kinds of healing. There's healing invisible things,
Hmm.
and there's healing uninvisible. So I would say a paralytic is a little bit in between that. You can't see a physical ailment when someone is a paralytic, but you know that the healing that took place is still invisible. And we noted that Jesus seems to only do invisible healing.
Hmm.
Similarly, Rav Yochanan and Rav Yochanan and Rav Chanina only did invisible healing, but the person was immediately able to stand up in a situation where they weren't. So I'm trying to create this cultural context that this wasn't so out of the norm from the stories that we hear
Hmm.
from the first through third century that people would heal. That being said, a paralytic is a lot more miraculous than whatever these two guys had because it just sounds like they were able to get up right away. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Yeah, would you like to say
So,
something?
yeah, so you use the term healer loosely, and so when you think of a healer, right? I mean, so what qualify? I mean, is that a sense of identity, or because so when I look at Jesus, right? So as from a Christian perspective, I look at him as God, and so from a God perspective, yes, he can do everything. I take this from a Jewish perspective. When you speak of rabbis, and you say this rabbi could show me how and he healed him, you give him a title of healer, and so is a healer, right? Like who is a healer? Is that somebody special, and are they different, or
So,
it's not a,
so,
he or she's not a prophet like Elijah or Elisha? They're not a prophet in that sense, but how do you
Well,
differentiate that?
you're bringing up a lot of questions. So first of all, I just want to throw away one, and then I think something you said is worth discussing even further in depth. But the first point is that a healer is someone who could heal, and the reason they could heal is because they have a special relationship with God. Rabbi Hanina, Rabbi Yochanan were famous Amoraim, famous rabbis who were leaders of their generation, and they're viewed almost as like the representatives of God on earth. And I can't tell you if the stories are make-believe stories or physically happen, but generally Judaism doesn't believe that people could just heal someone left and right. So I view these more as the point of the story is to note that their suffering was not dear to them, and that's meant to bring out that theological, philosophical, and metaphysical point. But when we talk about Jesus being a healer, you noted that there's two ways to look at it. He's not viewed as a healer because he is a really famous rabbi, but you noted that the Godhead is in him, or he is himself as
Yeah.
God, or so I would note that. Would you say that when Jesus was living or only after he's dead? Because when you look at Jesus when he's alive, it doesn't look like he can do anything he wants, right? At least when you read the Gospels. And I think I posed this question to you earlier. Do you believe, or do you think when you read the Gospels that Jesus is immune to the vicissitudes of reality, that he can just do what he wants, he's controlling? Because I think when you look at this, it feels, at least from a reader's perspective, that Jesus is bound into some historical will, and it might be that God's will, it might be his will, but it doesn't feel that he has 100% control. He could bend the rules, he could heal people, he could do miracles, but it doesn't look like he could completely opt out of the system. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that's just at least how it feels to a reader.
Yeah, now that's a profound observation, right? So in a sense, like you see, fully God, but like he has some God power, but he's bound by the rules of the system. He's trying to work within it. He has some constraints, and so and I think this is where Christians we kind of look at this thing. He was both God and man, and we don't have a full answer to that. Or we say it's kind of magical, like he was God, but he was also man at the same time. I don't have so it's more of a so it's not so much analytic. It's not so much I can explain this away, but I hold this hold the tension in balance, like fully believing in a sense that he was fully man and being fully constrained by the elements of by the rules of this universe, and
But but
in a
but
way,
not, right? But like
and
but not fully constrained because he's doing stuff
he's
that
doing
other
stuff.
people can't do.
Yeah, and so in that sense, we think yeah, he was fully God, but he was also he subjected himself to God's will. And at least that's the Christian view of this. Where
It's complicated, right?
it's
Like
complicated.
the movie Dogma talks about this a lot. I don't know if you remember that movie, but the movie Dogma says like it was very uncomfortable for Jesus as a youth to kind of put all this pressure on him. He didn't know how to like deal with it. It's a comedy movie, so we shouldn't take it, but we should take it with a grain of salt. But the point is that from the reader's perspective, and I'll try to find you just like even right here, the last verse in 8:34 says, "Then the whole town came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave." So Jesus could have done something to make them believe more, or to make them not beg him to leave, or make him like but he's like, oh, that sucks. I guess I have to leave, And then after getting into the boat, he crossed the sea and came back across into the Galilee. So it seems that Jesus did go through some uncomfortable situations that he 100% could have obviated by doing some additional miraculous or something. But again, it's just interesting to see that these limits.
Yeah, and I think we also want to put this in context, right? So what we have is so much the first century, people what Matthew and the other gospel writers that they wrote about Jesus. It's not so much his full life story. they picked and chose what they thought was important for people to know, and so maybe in that sense, they like it seems so like like it wasn't like this. He says, "Just pick up your bed and walk," and a person walked, and it feels as though he has so complete authority. But there are also places where he was constrained by the powers that be or the rules of the system, and so I think we'll also want to balance. Did the gospel writers, or in this case Matthew in particular, how did he really want his audience to both wrestle with this concept of what this is? And again, now I'm speaking about this with 2,000 years of Christian Pauline theology and all this has shaped us, right? So when I think of Matthew, how again did he see the tension between God and man, or to him was it just completely acceptable to him in his in the first century time, that completely acceptable to them that one can be both God and man at the same time? I don't have a clear answer to this one, uh, but it's a question I grapple with. You bring up a great point. I said, how can he be both fully God and fully man? Or how do we reconcile this seeming tension where some places he has complete authority, other places he's bound by the rules of the system? He could have done a little bit more, when people said go away, he could have done things differently. He seems places where he's just submissive to what's happening, but in some other cases not so much. But there's the other point to bring up where this healing is mostly invisible. It's a different type
Well,
of healing.
this is a higher level of visibility because there's invisible, like you had a cold and now you don't have a cold, but there's
Yeah.
like you can't walk and now you can walk. So this is a little bit more. Okay, well, this is a great question. So we could put this on the
Can
side.
I can I
Yeah.
can I just ask you one last question, right? I know, so you mentioned that as a healer, right, they're God's representatives on earth. I found that to be a very profound comment. So we typically look at prophets as God's representative on earth, right? Are you saying that that because the calling of being God's representative on earth, that's a very high supreme calling.
Well,
It's
I
the
just meant like they have miracle workers have some authority because of their knowledge or relationship with God, right? That's the nature of like you can have a healer who is arbitrarily chosen by lottery by God. There's no reason
Mhm.
that can't happen. But I think from a religious and theological perspective, we don't see that happening. Everyone who can do miracles is usually it's purposeful. To have someone who's like opting out of the system and able like when we see in the Bible in the Torah, we have like one of the famous questions is this week's parsha. We have this idea of this miracle worker, namely Bilham, and he's able to do and talk of God. And it's anything a theological question. How could Bilham, this guy who eventually is killed in the Bible and seemingly working against the Israelites, where does this power come from? And you have to say he has some unique relationship with God independent of the Bible, because otherwise, how is he able to even in dreams speak of God? How is he able to have this crazy donkey experience,
Mhm.
these miracles? So I think that whenever you have these people who are outside the system, it's a question. Okay, so next thing I want to do, again, I know we don't do so regularly. I want to do first is I just want to compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke because I want to make a very key point about the nature of what we would expect to see and what we do see. So to review what we said in Matthew, it says, and he stood up and went to his home. So he did two things: standing, showing that he is healed. B, went home. Why did he go home? Well, it says one verse earlier: stand up, take your bed, and go home. So on the one hand, he is listening to him.
Mhm.
But if I ask you, why did Jesus tell him to go home?
Yeah, because I would imagine as a paralytic, he was probably he didn't live in his house. He was probably he was outcast by society. He lived in a
Oh, I mean, he's,
so,
he's getting carried around though, so
yeah,
he's definitely part of it somehow. And
somehow.
again, and the best explanation is that he's super rich. But I'm just saying, like the idea of going home. If I told you, like, let's just use this in a contemporaneous context. Isaac, it was great learning with you today. Go home. How would you interpret that?
Well, as in it's time to sign off and head home, as in head back to where I
But but
live.
but once you say, but even when it probably is stressful to
Yeah,
your ears right now. When someone tells you to go home, but even then, it almost sounds like a severing of the current dynamic of this bilateral conversation and
yeah.
saying it's over. If I said, Isaac, it's been a pleasure learning with you today, I'm going to go get a Slurpee, that would be normal. And that would be kind of like what we'd expect. But I said, Isaac, it's been a learning with you, go home. It kind of says we're done. like at a more
Yeah,
meaningful and more strong, more poignant level.
hmm
So the fact that Matthew writes, and he went home, on the one hand, it's a fulfillment of what he was commanded to do a moment ago. On the other hand, it's also like, I don't know, like weird, but it's noticeable, it's noteworthy that Jesus said, go home. So, okay. So that's Matthew. Let's now look at Mark. And Mark, and this is verse 2, was it 2:11 and 12 read. So 2:11 it says, I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home. Good. Almost identical, to do those three things. But then the next verse is not what we see in Matthew. It says he stood up, check. He immediately, Mark usually adds immediacy, so that's not a surprise that Mark added the immediacy. He immediately took the mat and went out. What did he do? He didn't listen to Jesus. He didn't go home. He went out before all of them so that they were amazed and glorified God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. So, Isaac, why did the paralytic not listen to Jesus? Matthew, the paralytic, is a great guy. He's doing exactly what he's told, and it shows, and he did the will of Jesus. But the second one, it says he actually didn't listen, but it sounded like he did something really even better than listening, right? He went and
hmm
glorified God, and everyone was amazed, and everyone came to this greater level of understanding. They never saw this. They're more Team Jesus probably now. It's amazing. So if Mark is so amazing, why is Matthew so lesser? And if Matthew's so lesser, why did Jesus command the paralytic to have this lesser situation?
Yeah, like, Rabbi, you asked such poignant questions, really thoughtful questions,
That's what I'm
which
here for.
and actually, as a Christian, I haven't looked at it this critical way. So, could it be that that in in Matthew's gospel, he's trying to downplay any sense of praise or any sense of adoration? He healed him; he was healed. The obvious thing will be to be joyful, to kind of be delighted, to tell people about it. But as you said, go home has a finality to it, as in it's more decisive, as in it's ending something. Was that Could it be it was meant to not portray any sense of glorification or glory or um, uh,
So,
you
so
know
Isaac, I think what you're saying is the right answer, but I want to sidebar it because this is why I want to be. I want to go to Luke, and I want to give you two other sources, and I think that I want you to keep this in your head. I think, and the way that you're saying is, what is Jesus's goal when he's dealing with other people? Okay, so let's sidebar that because that's exactly what I want to continue on. Let's just read the Luke source, and then we'll read one more source back in Matthew, and then we'll see some other sources. But this is such a fundamental question, right? Like, we'll say it. We'll say it. What's Jesus trying to do? Could
what's
you
trying
imagine? Can you imagine a more fundamental question? You know when he was on Earth and living and doing all this stuff? Why? What was he doing?
why?
Okay. So and then when we see in Luke, and this is 5:25 and 26, immediately he stood up before them. Oh, sorry, let's read the verse before so you see what he is told to do. So verse 5:24. But that so you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the one who's paralyzed, I say to you, stand up, take your bed and go home. Identical. A, B, C. Good. Same as Mark. And then 25, immediately he stood up. He immediately, just like in Mark, he stood up immediately, took what he'd been lying on. Okay. Took the mat, took the bed. Good. And went to his home, glorifying God. So Luke is a combination of Matthew. So he listened to Jesus. Good. You should listen. But he glorified God on the way. Amazement seized all of them and they're glorifying and all the good things. So Luke, I feel the person who saw Luke saw Matthew and Mark and was troubled. Luke goes, how could he not listen? But it's amazing that he was able to glorify God. And therefore, Luke combined those two sources and said he did both. What an amazing answer. Great, great, great times. But now we have our original question. So, so we have the question, what is Jesus trying to accomplish? So, on the hand, we did talk about in the past, was he trying to collect apostles? Was he trying to collect people? And I think when we look back at the story, just in this chapter, in chapter 8 and 8:14 to 15, when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying in the bed with a fever. He touched her hand and the fever left her. Very similar here, did all
hmm
actions. And then she got up, same thing,
And
and
she
began to
said,
serve him.
hmm
So we have a model where he didn't demand it, but that
hmm
she did it. And then we also have other examples where he tells people the very next two stories later in 8:18, and the scribe approached him and he said the whole story, but Jesus said, follow me and let the bed there that buries dead. So we have three models now here. We have one, Jesus said nothing, and the person decided to serve him. That is Peter's mother-in-law. And that's in 8:14. And then we have the second model in 8:18, where Jesus says, "Follow me, forget the other stuff you're doing." So, and then we have a third model where we have in Matthew where he says, "Go home. We're done." So it could be it has to do with the individuals, and we don't know enough about these three individuals to make a hypothesis about why they're special, that he wants them to follow or not. But we see that Jesus has this mixed reality about when he's trying to make people follow. And I think that's very interesting for us to know. It's interesting because, first of all, we see a very similar parallel in the book of Ruth, where Ruth is one of the daughter-in-laws of Naomi, and the other one's Orpah. And we see in chapter 1 already that Orpah says, "It's not working out here in Moab, go back home." And they broke into weeping in verse 114, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, farewell. And she went, but Ruth clung to her, even though Naomi told her to go away. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law," so this is Naomi speaking, "See, your sister-in-law returned to her people and her gods. Go, you return. With your
Mm-hmm.
sister-in-law, go leave." But Ruth replied, "Do not urge me to leave, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God be my people. When you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." Okay, and Naomi agreed. She went back to Judah, and it was fine. So we see that already in the book of Ruth, you have this model where someone says, "Go away," and then you can still override that. So I think the question is, what is Jesus trying to do? And I wanted to give you one more example from the Talmud. And I'm only giving it because it's a fun story, because I think it's fun to read fun stories. But the story is from the Talmud BT Avodah Zara 11a. And it's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to read it to you rather quickly. So and I'll read you maybe an abridged version of it. Okay. So there's a story that Onkelus, the son of Colonimus, a very famous convert to Judaism, born to a Roman royal family, was a convert um, from the whatever Roman paganism was at that time. And the Caesar sent a unit of soldiers to bring Onkelus to him, probably to kill him because he was unhappy with Onkelus converting to Judaism. So Caesar, what happened though, when the Roman soldiers came close to him, he started reciting a verse, and they were so interested in it, they converted to Judaism too. So now, not only did he lose Onkelus, he lost two soldiers. So Caesar sent another group of soldiers, and they warned him, saying, "Don't say anything to him, don't listen to him." And they went walking on their way, and he said to them that he would like to tell them he liked to tell them something secular. So it's a custom of the world that when a minor official walks with a greater one, the lesser one carries a torch and walks ahead of him. This is the manner of all levels of officials, all the way of the power chain. But does the king light a torch for another person? Onkelos asked rhetorically. They said no. He told them, but the Holy One, blessed be, takes a torch and goes ahead of the Jewish people. And they are so excited, they converted. So now 5 people converted. So the Caesar's like, "I got to get this guy, but I can't." No
Mm-hmm.
talking. So he says, "Next group, no matter what, don't talk." So as Onkelos was walking, so they said, "We're not going to say anything. You don't say anything." So he agreed. So after the soldiers took hold of him and they were leaving, Onkelos saw the mezuzah on the doorpost, just like we have mezuzahs today. And he went and put his hand on it. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he explained to them the importance of the mezuzah, and they went and converted.
Hmm.
So what's interesting about that is that Onkelos never tried to make these people convert. His actions themselves were the way he lived his life
Mm-hmm.
was the baptism, was the way to cleanse people or to make them flip to come to a new religion. So I feel like when we look at Jesus and we see these three models of him healing, him living his life, him collecting apostles, or him turning people away, was it that he was living his life and that itself was attractive? Or was it that he was really turning people away? And what we see in Matthew, the way I read Go Home, is that in general, Jesus was not trying to make you join his team. With Peter's mother-in-law, 100% was. With this man, when he saw the crowd, he had a scribe approach him. So a scribe was a rabbi already. He says, "I'm going to follow you already." That the case was someone who said, "I'm already a part of your team." So once a person proactively says, "I'm part of your team," I think Jesus then welcomes them. He says, "Okay, this is the life you want to live. Let's go live a life together." But otherwise, he doesn't. And the reason I think this is so important is because when we get to the very, very, very famous idea of the Great Commission, do you know what the Great Commission is?
Yeah, going into all the world,
Okay, so
baptize them in
so
the.
so so tell me about your perspective on the Great Commission.
Yeah, so okay, but before we go there, right, this is a great observation you make, right? So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is like he's showing his life story as good enough for people to believe in him or to follow him, which kind of fits with Matthew's overall focus on behavior and actions, right? We discussed this earlier where Matthew was focused upon conduct, upon what you do. And it's not so much of what you say, but your actions and behavior. And so, in that sense, like the way Matthew has portrayed Jesus here, it fits within this broader theme. But your question on how does this relate with the
What is
great
he trying to do, right? Is
yeah
he it's such a fundamental question because I think when you think of a marketing person, the goal is to get more people involved. And the question is, what does involvement in Christianity mean in the first century? Does that mean just, as I keep talking, the religious beer goggles to see the world differently? Does it mean to believe the world differently, or does it mean to act differently, or does it mean to actually join the team and follow them around? So those are really four different stages that you can imagine being very, very different.
but can them all be grouped into one, right? So in the sense, because
Sure.
can you really act unless uh, like you can have the Jesus beer goggles and not act, but can you act and not have the Jesus beer the Jesus goggles, in the sense that in a sense, acting presupposes that you already believe that you have these certain things, certain qualities in place, right? And so, um, because one can have the Jesus goggles but not act, right? That could be a different reading. But if you act, then that presupposes that you have those goggles. So I want to put this back to you, right? So is it really four different perspectives, or is that they're all at different tiers? That if you're at this tier, then it presupposes that all the other ones
Well,
are all.
I'm only making up these tiers because I think that's what we see in Matthew. I'm not trying to like create a paradigm. I'm just saying that when we look at it, there's different attitudes to different people. And even when we saw when he collected disciples earlier on, like he kind of said, like, come on, let's go. So it's unclear. It's hard to make an algorithm to explain why some people he says come, there's not. But it does look like when people are proactive and say, I want to be part of the team, he welcomes you part of the team and even says, as we saw in chapter 8, he might tell people like, yeah, you should give up on doing your normal stuff.
Mhm.
So the Great Commission, what I think is interesting, aside from like the we view like the preterists who believe that like it is already the Great Commission is already fulfilled in when they went out in Mark 16:20 and they went out and preached everywhere, and that means it's fulfilled, versus standard evangelical today who views it as the obligation to go and fulfill Matthew 28:16. And just reminding
Mhm.
us, Matthew 28:16 says, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountains which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So even when you read this, like Isaac, if I told you read this as a literalist versus read this as a poet, a literalist would take the Great Commission as opposed to the preterists and say, like a normal evangelical does, and says that I have to go emphasize ministry,
Mhm.
missionary work, evangelism, baptism, and
Mhm.
go out and what we know the apostles what they do. They went and set up Corinth and Philippi and other cities, and that seems to be in fulfillment of a more literalist read of this. But the poetic side of me, at least when I read this, it sounds like, we're done. You don't need me anymore. Like I gave you everything, all authority in heaven has been given to me, and now I'm saying go and do more. Like whatever, we don't even know what this means, but all authority is like I'm done. So you guys have to go and do more. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you should evangelize or baptize or reach out. It just means like you got to spread the word and be who you need to be. So I feel the poetic side of me, especially when you read verse 20, and remember I am with you always. It's like a goodbye message. It's like
Rabbi, that's a very profound reading, Rabbi. So I haven't, so,
you hang out with evangelicals all day.
yeah. So the first perspective is so
You
common, right?
haven't heard the non-evangelical read, Isaac?
No,
What?
I haven't, right? So, the early reading, right? The literal reading, that's very common, as in, as in go do something, evangelize them or baptize them in the Spirit and preach God's name. That's a very common read. I like your poetic read where you say, you don't need me anymore. You already have everything you have. Go live your life and go live your life according to all that I've taught you. So it does not it's not limited to only just preaching the gospel or baptizing them, but it's, I think, but the way I think the way what he's saying is it's much more broader. It encompasses a whole range of things. It's not limited to only these two or three actions, but go live your life, or have these actions which, based on what I've shared before, so that so through that the kingdom will come.
Right. And even if we like compare, like, I'm not saying I don't want to give like this Jewish read, but when you look at like Matthew 10:5 to 42, it definitely has the impression in Matthew 10:5, which we'll see hopefully soon, that the mission is restricted to Jews, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I find it okay and appropriate to say that it's unclear what Jesus was trying to accomplish. It's unclear who he was trying to make him join his team. It does look like the people who are proactive, he allowed to join the team. Everyone else, he just wanted to spread this theological beer goggles to make sure everyone kind of could see the world differently, especially when we look at the Beatitudes. And when I look at the Great Commission, I don't read it like the full preterists where they say that it was already fulfilled. I view it more in a poetic sense that this is my like dying wish for all y'all, for everyone to do. And I think that way, when we look at this idea, like going back to how we started with Matthew, go home,
Hmm.
that makes sense. And then we look at, though, the way that what Luke, how it combines Mark and Matthew, it's like the best way. Go home, but when you go home, you should make sure you need to glorify throughout. Because the
Hmm.
point of you going home, the point of you going back to your life is to not just throw away the life-changing experience of Jesus, but is in order to kind of live this life that is now glorifying God.
I mean, so. But this idea, right, of glorifying God, this would have been consistent with Jewish belief, right? As
I
a
mean, I think probably tomorrow we'll talk about what it means to glorify God. But even if we don't, it's unclear, right? Like the idea, like we talked about saying the Kaddish or saying the Lord's Prayer, definitely is viewed at least from a prayer sense of a way to glorify God. But it could be the way to glorify God is just by keeping commandments or being helping old ladies cross the street or by hanging out with Jesus all day. It's unclear to say the least.
Yeah, so but in that sense, right, that's more closely aligned with Judaism, as in Judaism was focused on actions and behavior, like you
Well,
keep
it doesn't say in Matthew, Mark, or Luke how they glorified. It
God,
just says like we don't know. I agree with you to read this as a orthopraxy perspective
or the
and not that and a non-antinomian perspective would be a more Jewish read. I hear that, but whatever you want it to mean is fine. Like I don't know what it means to glorify, but I think it's one of those things, maybe I don't know what it means, but if I see it, I'll know it.
Yeah, and I think the way you unpacked the Great Commission so far, I think within Christian circles, it's much more literal, as in you go do these three things, baptize them, do these things. But versus when you take a broader view, it's more as an invitation, as in I'm done with this part of my story, and go do whatever you have to do to bring about the kingdom. And in that sense, it removes the focus on that three or four particular actions, and then it shifts the burden on the way a person would live their life, or on the to your earlier comment about orthopraxis. It shifts the focus upon it shifts the focus from from this belief of doing these things to orthopraxis of practicing certain behavior, or practicing certain behaviors.
Right, I hear.
I wonder how the world might be if Christians didn't have this literal view of the Great Commission, right? That would be you
I'm not
know
sure. I don't think it would be different because this idea of either whatever you want to call it, proselytizing or evangelizing, even an exclusivistic religion like Judaism that sees proselytizing amongst non-Jews as not an ideal situation, it's still, you feel like there's a certain elitism that you could not live this life, but you would be wrong. So I feel like anyone who really advocates the truth of their religion will want to share it and will want to spread it, not only from a marketing and branding perspective, just because like share the good word. So I'm not sure if we didn't have this verse or we didn't have the idea of the Great Commission, I think it still would have existed. I don't think we have to tie it
yeah.
directly to this verse from Matthew 28.
Yeah, so okay, that's interesting. So in that sense, right? Um, hmm. So would you have still see? So it's fair to say, right? If he didn't have Matthew, the Great Commission here, people would have still shared the gospel or what they know about Jesus, but the focus wouldn't be so much on proselytizing, right? So would you make a distinction between glorifying God's name and sharing his what he's done, what he's done doing versus proselytizing? Because proselytizing, in a sense, is more focused on trying to change you,
Change.
not so much of showing what he's
Well, again,
done.
like what I would argue with like with Islam, an exclusivist religion, is that if you don't proselytize, you kind of almost like undermine the truth of your mission. If you have the truth, why are you a bad person? Why wouldn't you share it? So I just think there's a nature of a true fact that you want to share it, especially when it's so meaningful like religion.
Why? So I'm intrigued. So why do you say within Judaism does not favor proselytizing? Why is it?
Well,
Is it
because Judaism is against proselytizing as a general, like at least like you could pick different time periods, but as a general policy, Judaism rejects people who try to come into our religion because Judaism admits that there's a notion of the other and is a notion of this individualism. And while Judaism defines the non-Jewish experience, saying like you're supposed to follow the seven Noahide laws, and you're supposed to do this, and you're not allowed to be an idolater, and you're allowed to do this, it defines it. It leaves a lot of room for individualism and pluralism and identity to be formed, where other religions deny the other's right to believe. Like Christianity and Christianity and Islam denies the right of other people to kind of live a non-Christian, like you're condemned.
that's a profound statement, Rabbi. You're saying
Yeah.
Christians. That's interesting. Okay. Uh-huh.
Like Judaism would say the righteous Gentiles have a place in heaven,
Uh-huh.
at least again, like everyone, there's so many different opinions, but at least in theory. But as you know, many Christians will
Mhm.
not be as sympathetic to
Correct. Would
people
not.
who don't jump onto the Jesus bandwagon, and Islam as well. There's different opinions, and there's definitely some room for pluralistic thought about what it means, especially in the medieval philosophers of Islam, about maybe you could, like Al-Farabi, you could be a political philosopher and achieve greatness. And that being said, though, as a general statement, the religions don't recognize the importance, significance, or ability to connect to truth or God without the Quran or the New Testament or
Mhm.
Jesus, in the sense that, like, I think any Buddhist would tell you, like, yeah, you don't need, I'm just like a helper. Like, you don't need anything I say. If you figured it all out yourself, like, amazing job. So no Buddhist would be exclusivistic at that point. They'd find it offensive, that exclusivism.
Yeah, in a sense, what I'm saying is, Hinduism and Buddhism, they're pantheistic. They're not that exclusive. But
Well,
I'm not.
I don't think it's the pantheism that allows it. Even if you have a Buddhist who, like, I mean, this, I understand this is a contradiction, but even if you had a Buddhist who was a monotheist, that monotheism wouldn't be exclusivistic.
Yeah, but
It's not the pantheism versus it's not the actual deity that's the issue. It's the actual access to truth
truth.
and they, if anything, I think a Buddhist would be humble about this. Like, if you would talk to a uh, a Theravada Buddhist and you said, like, I found a way to reach nirvana, or something along those lines, he'd be like, you want to share that? That sounds amazing. Like, spread the word. And if you said it has nothing to do with Buddhism, he'd be like, that's amazing. And even when we look at the Buddha from a Mahayana perspective, the Buddha is always like, he's just teaching you the five ways, or ways that, like, this is how I figured it out. But he
Mhm.
figured it out. He didn't have like it was an epiphany and it wasn't a revelation. That's a good
Yeah,
way to
so
say it.
yeah, Rabbi, I think I'm tracking with all that. And to your point, Christianity and Islam are very exclusive, have exclusive mindset. But I think, Judaism also would be exclusive, right? Because Judaism has like
Right, right. So,
Judaism.
so Judaism is a gray area, I think, but our exclusivism allows and for people to, again, like, I agree. Again, and Islam also has dhimmi, or people of the book, and Christians also recognize that there might be some good people out there, but as a general policy,
Yeah.
Judaism has this idea of the non-Jewish nations who are never meant to convert, and they could live their truth, and they could try to be good people, and they'd be better off, according to Judaism, if they would recognize, like, the whatever the historical or philosophical realities of Judaism. But putting that aside, you could live a fully enlightened
Right.
non-Jewish life.
I'm reminded of Rabbi Sachs' book, The Late Rabbi, The Dignity of Difference. And I have to think about this a bit because, so in that sense, because there he promoted a
Yeah,
sense
he
of,
makes this argument there, correct.
yeah, his argument there. Anyway, so we'll have to unpack that a bit some other time.
Okay, Isaac, to be continued. So
To
good
begin.
speaking to you.
Rabbi, likewise, thank you.
Yeah.